The measure of intelligence is the ability to change. Hi all, Dr. Clark here, and today we're going to do an overview of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis can be an extremely complex subject. Most of you get just a glimpse or know a glimpse of photosynthesis. This lecture I'm going to dive into a little bit more than plants take in sun and convert it into sugar, but I'm not going to dive into all the proteins and accessory pigments and electron carriers and things like that that are involved in photosynthesis. Okay, most of you know that plants have the capability of capturing light and converting that sunlight into sugar. Okay? But the process by which they do is what we're going to cover now, and that's photosynthesis. And it occurs in two main forms. A form that we call the light reaction, pictured on this side of the kind of screen, is the light reaction. That's the part of the reaction that photons from some light source, normally the sun, but you can do artificial photons with, growing things under like greenhouse lights or black lights or UV lights, whatever it might be. Okay, but they're still doing the same thing. They're still capturing photons. So taking in water, capturing photons, and releasing oxygen as a waste product, kicking over to what's sometimes called the dark reaction, or the Calvin cycle, or the light independent reaction. It's got quite a few names, okay? But kicks it over here, that kicks out glucose, okay? And in doing so, they can take in carbon dioxide. We'll cover all this in much more detail. Okay, so the overview of photosynthesis. When we're talking about photosynthesis, we're talking about organisms that have the capability of consuming photons, converting those photons or that energy from the sun into chemical energy or bonded energy, normally in the form of glucose. Now, there are quite a few different groups that can do this. So the kingdom Plantae can do this, the kingdom Bacteria can do this, and there's even organisms in the kingdom Protista that can do this. And that is, they can capture photons and do the process of photosynthesis. Now, one thing that we'll talk about at a later date is the amount of energy that's coming from the sun. Okay, I've heard people say before, well, if we put up a bunch of solar panels, are we not just going to capture all the energy from the sun, so the plants will start dying off? They won't have enough energy, or the planet will cool too much, or something like that. No, none of those are even remotely possible, because the fact is only about 1% of the available energy that's coming from the sun into the planet is ever captured. And so the rest of that energy that's coming in, the other 99%, is absorbed by water sources or absorbed by land sources or reflected back into the atmosphere and back off the planet. Okay, so the ability to capture energy is tremendous coming from the sun. So we really don't have to worry about capturing too much energy and destroying plant life on our planet, or changing the temperature too rapidly or anything like that. We'll come back and talk about that maybe when we progress with world issues. Life on the planet really is evolving around the ability for photosynthesis to occur. Okay, there are other ways at which organisms can obtain energy, and that's through something like chemosynthesis, which means that photons aren't involved, but it was just chemicals are broken down, and the energy from that is utilized to drive the formation of new chemical molecules. Okay, but by and large, probably 95% of life on the planet evolves around this process of photosynthesis. Okay, so we're going to talk about how photosynthesis might have evolved or might have came about, okay, and the process by which it occurs. We know this, that leaves in plants, the majority of leaves in plants, is the site of photosynthesis, and they contain a organelle called chloroplasts. Now, chloroplasts have a connection to bacteria in the sense that chloroplasts have a circular DNA. So they have a single chromosome. It's circular. So they have their own DNA, which is strange because they occur in a cell with a nucleus which has the DNA for that organism. But chloroplasts have their own DNA, and instead of being linear chromosomes, it's a circular chromosome. Bacteria also have circular chromosomes. So there's this connection between chloroplasts and bacteria, and that whole connection and the whole theory is called the theory of endosymbiosis, that prokaryotes, non-nucleated cells, gave rise to eukaryotes, nucleated cells. Okay? And there's quite a bit of evidence. Chloroplast is one of them, mitochondria is another. There's quite a bit of evidence for endosymbiosis. Okay, so chloroplasts, what are their functions? What makes up a chloroplast? Well, chloroplasts have internal membranes that we call thylakoid or thylakoid membranes. Okay, thylakoid membranes have a direct association with protein complexes and accessory pigment complexes or pigment complexes that allow for them to capture sunlight, photons, and they allow for electrons to move through the system, protons to be pumped and create a gradient, and then chemical energy or bond energy to form. Okay, and we're going to cover these different pieces. If you take a bunch of thylakoid membranes and you stack them together in a column, they're called the grana or granum. And then the fluid that surrounds these thylakoid membranes is called the stroma. And so when we're talking about where electrons are coming from or where protons are being pumped, I want you to keep in mind the stroma is on the outside of the thylakoid. A stack of thylakoids called a granum, and that membrane is called the thylakoid membrane of an individual. Okay. All right, so fairly common, fairly simple, simplistic overview is sun comes in, plant leaves capture it. Okay, so here you can see a cross section of the plant leaf. Okay, we'll probably talk about some of these regions, but just realize that the photons are allowed or are capable of penetrating the cuticle layer of most plants, the cuticle layer, and then into the epidermis, and then into the mesophyll and into the vascular bundles. Okay, the vascular bundles and even the mesophyll and epidermis layers, they have the capability to do photosynthesis. Right, but a lot of the photosynthesis is going to be occurring in the vascular bundle region, or at least a lot of the carbohydrates will be made in that region because it's close to an opening called the stomata. The stomata or stoma, okay, is where plants capture carbon dioxide. Okay, so they can open these cells, which are called guard cells. They open them up and carbon dioxide can come in to the plant leaf. At the same time, oxygen leaves the plant leaf. Okay, now that's important because oxygen building up in plant leaves is toxic to the plant. It actually, if a plant holds a bunch of oxygen, the plant will die. Okay, at least the leaf material in that region will die. We'll talk about how that works. But so oxygen leaves, carbon dioxide comes in. Sometimes water leaves, and I shouldn't say sometimes. Majority of the time, water leaves. Now, how much water leaves the leaf will depend on temperature, time of day, okay, how much water the leaf has to lose. I mean, lots of things will determine that. Okay, so you pull one of these cells, you look in the cell, and you'll see chloroplasts. And if you look inside a chloroplast, you'll see thylakoids. And if you look inside or look at a bunch of thylakoids together, you'll see granum. And the space in between is the stroma. Okay? That's the site of photosynthesis. So when we're talking about photosynthesis, we're talking about things that are occurring inside the thylakoid and between the thylakoid membrane and the stroma. Okay? All right, so photosynthesis is broken up into photosystems, okay? And we're going to talk about each one of the photosystems. Thylakoids, like I said before, they have a series of proteins and a series of pigments. Okay, pigments are a molecule, a unique molecule that's able to capture photons. And they have these pigments and proteins embedded in their membrane. The primary pigment, or the one that most people know and is probably, know probably about it, is by far the most common pigment found in plants, is chlorophyll. Now, there are two types of chlorophyll in Plantae, the kingdom Plantae. There are two types of chlorophyll, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Okay, and the structure of the molecule is a little bit different. The wavelengths at which they can capture is a little bit different, and the wavelengths at which they reflect is a little bit different. Okay. Now, there are other chlorophyll molecules out there. Bacteria have their own chlorophyll molecules. It's not A and B. It's I think it's C and D. Okay, don't quote me on that. I'm fairly confident it's C and D. But at any rate, the only reason it gets a different name is because the structure is a little bit different. The molecule's a little bit different. Okay. So these pigments, chlorophyll, and these other pigments, which we call accessory pigments, build what we call an antenna complex, or an antenna region in the thylakoid membrane. The antenna, you can kind of think of it as maybe like a dish that is capturing photons. And these different chlorophyll molecules have the ability to capture photons, etc. When that chlorophyll molecule or accessory pigment captures that photon, the energy from that photon, it causes what we call resonant energy, and that energy moves from one chlorophyll molecule, one pigment, to the next. Okay, and it builds up energy, and eventually it has enough energy that when it makes it to what we call the reaction center, it can excite an electron. It can get the electron to move from the reaction center to an electron carrier. Okay, so when we're talking about these pigments, you need to realize that it's not just chlorophyll. Like I said before, there's chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B. Okay, we haven't talked about this, but carotenoids are what gives things the color of like red or orange. So here you can see this is the spectrum, the wavelength spectrum of visible light. And these are the wavelengths at which they can absorb. So if we look at chlorophyll B and A, they can absorb light red and orange, and they can absorb light blue and purple or ultraviolet or violet. Okay? They don't absorb things in the green range. This is why plant leaves, for the most part, are green because chlorophyll A and B are the dominant pigments. Okay, that's why a majority of plants are green, is because they're reflecting the wave patterns at about 550 nanometers. Well, if we look at something like carotenoids, you can see here that carotenoids, they drop off. There's no absorption in the red and orange region. Well, carotenoids is what gives plants like red flowers or red or orange flowers. Those are carotenoids that give that color off. Like carrots being orange, etc. That's because of the carotenoids that are in that tissue. Okay, so you can think whatever color it is will determine what the main pigment in that tissue is. So if it's green, it's going to be chlorophyll A or B. If it's, if it's red or orange, it's going to be carotenoids. If it's yellow, it's going to be xenophils. So there's all kinds of different pigment molecules, okay? And often if they're not chlorophyll, they're called accessory pigments, so additional pigments. Okay, so photosynthesis takes place in three main stages. Okay? The first stage, we kind of just went over a little bit of it, and that is capture energy from the sunlight. Different molecules, different pigments have the ability to capture different wavelengths of sun. Okay. Then the second step is to use the energy that's been captured from the sun to produce chemical energy, or what we call bond energy. And that's in either the form of ATP or what we call an electron carrier in the form of NADPH. Then you use the material from, or the energy from ATP and NADPH, you use that energy to reconfigure carbon dioxide and water to make carbohydrates. Okay? We're going to go through these different steps. All right, so the process of photosynthesis is divided into two types of reactions. I just said there's three steps, but two types of reactions. The first type of reaction, we already discussed this at the beginning, is the light-dependent reaction. Now, light-dependent means this reaction needs photons in order for it to occur. This would encompass the first two steps of the three-step process, and that is to capture light, capture photon, capture energy from sun, okay? Convert that energy into ATP and NADPH. The second type is light independent, sometimes called the dark cycle, sometimes called the Calvin cycle. There's lots and lots of names for this cycle, but at any rate, this cycle occurs or can occur without the presence of photons. So no photons needed, no sunlight needed. So sometimes it occurs at night, sometimes it occurs during the day, but there's no input from sunlight needed. Because the energy for this cycle is coming from this cycle, or the energy for this reaction is coming from this reaction in the form of that ATP and NADPH. Okay. All right, so it can be summarized very simplistically and should be summarized very simplistically, just realizing that there are lots of steps involved. This is a very old system. Most likely, the first organisms that had the capability of doing something similar to photosynthesis evolved about, roughly 3 billion years ago. Maybe not quite 3 billion, but maybe 2.5 billion years ago. So the process has been around for a very long time. It's had many, many mutations, and it's very streamlined, I guess you could say. That doesn't mean it's super efficient, okay? But it's streamlined enough that the process works, and all plants kind of follow the same general rule of the process. And so do all photosynthetic bacteria, all photosynthetic protista. They follow the same process. And they use the same equation. And the equation is they consume carbon dioxide, typically 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. They consume water, somewhere around 12 molecules of water. Now, this will totally depend on where the organisms are at. Okay, if the organism lives in water, then, consumption of 12 molecules of water, it may be that they don't need 12 molecules of water. Okay, maybe they only need 6 molecules of water for the process to work. Okay, but we'll just go with this equation. It's a simple equation. Now, there are some minor things that can be adjusted. Light energy, we know that light energy is coming from the sun typically in the form of photons. And that's going to yield C6H12O6, glucose. Okay, again, there are other sugars. There are other monosaccharides that can be formed from this process. Okay, fructose has the same chemical equation as glucose. It's just where the bonds are placed is a little bit different. So it could be that that plant is utilizing the same material, and instead of making glucose, it's making fructose. But C6H12O6 glucose, okay, water and oxygen. Okay, so this is the equation for photosynthesis. Now, I want to make sure that you understand these are the products. Okay, these are the reactants. So glucose, water, and oxygen is the product of photosynthesis. But the only one that the plant, well, I shouldn't say that. The only two that the plant are utilizing is glucose and water. Okay, oxygen, it truly is toxic for plants. So you can think of oxygen as it is a product, but it's a waste product. Okay, so they're getting rid of oxygen as fast as they can. Okay, and that's important to know because the cycle of photosynthesis and the cycle of cellular respiration, they're complementary. So while photosynthesis, the waste product is oxygen that's needed for cellular respiration, the waste product is carbon dioxide that's needed for photosynthesis. So it's a giant cycle, and they're complementary of each other. Okay, so next time when we come back, we're going to talk about the light-dependent reaction, and we're going to dive in to the different components of the light-dependent reaction.